Although this old girl has a motor in the back of her Honda, she's not been doing much spinning lately. It is time to electro-fly, my baby. The inherited electrics consisted of a 10 amp 220 volt switch attached to the end of a short length of petrified rubber line cord. Although the switch would probably work okay, I wanted to install a proper magnetic safety switch, a reasonable length of cable, and a new plug that would work with the 220 volt outlets in my shop. I wasn't crazy about having the power switch down on the stand. When I invite the ladies over for a shop/house party, things can get kinda crazy, and I didn't want some honey bumping the planer on whilst twerking to Nicki Minaj. I don't do much metalworking, but I figured I could cobble together something basic. I first cut through 3 sides of some 1-inch square tubing with a cutoff wheel. I was all prepared to use massive power to bend the tubing, but it turned out to be super easy, and I felt a little foolish afterwards. This was my first foray into doing some welding. I had picked up a basic MIG welder recently, but hadn't had any time to do anything with it until this project. As such, you are witnessing my very first time ever making beads. I am certain that if a respectable welder saw my fumbling effort, he or she would chuckle and call me a noob. It's okay, I am a noob. Still, I managed to stitch together the cut lines I had made earlier. After copious amounts of grinding, the results didn't look too bad, at least aesthetically. I certainly wouldn't trust my life to this weld faux show. My plan was to mount the power switch to a stalk that attaches to the stand. You'll see I'm deliberately drilling off center here. That's to ensure I have enough room for a bolt and 2 thick power cords to fit next to each other and run all the way through this tubing. It was important that the control stalk sit parallel to the planer bed. I'll show you why a little later in this video. Top of the stalk got a couple of mounting holes drilled in it, along with an access hole for the wiring. The electrical box also got a pass-through hole drilled in it. Line power and switch power cords could then be threaded through, and the entire assembly was bolted to the stand. Hindsight, it would have been far easier to strip the wires before pulling them through, as they were really thick and unwieldy. Also had to be careful not to nick the actual wire under the insulation. Hindsight. Making all the connections to the switch was straightforward. Everything came together without any hassle. Everything fit into the oversized box very nicely. For gearbox lubrication, I decided to weigh a full tube of grease, which came in at 15.3 ounces. I then pumped a full tube into the bottom of the gearbox and weighed the empty tube. That came in at 1.2 ounces. The manual calls for approximately 1 pound of grease, so I figured I'd need slightly more than one full tube. When filling the gearbox, I started out by lubricating as much of the chain and gears that I could reach and moved them through their positions by manually spinning the belts. After I had all the surfaces that I could reach covered, I pumped the last of it into the bottom. I ended up using a little over 1.5 tubes. I wanted to make sure there was enough grease in the bottom that it would be picked up by the gears during normal operation. The next step was to lubricate all of the bearing points. I made a goof here in not fully cleaning out the Zerk fittings during the disassembly. I had a really hard time with a few of them getting grease down into the joint. I ended up having to pull a few of them out and clean out some stuck gunk. After reinstallation, I was then able to lubricate everything that needed it. The power cord was standard rubber sheathed 600 volt rated 10.3 stuff that I picked at Home Depot with a new 220 volt dual spade plug. The plugs go together with a few screws and they're quite solid. I ended up with about 25 feet of cord. All right, here we go. First start ever. The idea of having two rather long rubber belts flailing around wildly while making adjustments to the bed height wasn't appealing to me, so even though the cost was kind of high, I swallowed hard and bought a replacement belt guard. The fit was pretty good overall. It needed a larger hole for the hand wheel to fit through, but the entire assembly installed easily enough with a couple of bolts that I just threaded into the stand. In deference to the elevation indicator on the side of the planer, I wanted a bit more precision and repeatability when adjusting the cut depth. My solution to this was an inexpensive 6-inch long digital readout, or DRO. I suspect the cheap Asian one I bought wouldn't have the accuracy needed for proper machine work, but it will be fine for woodworking. I actually did some basic measurements with a set of calipers, and the readout showed accuracy to around 20 thousandths or so across the full length. To mount the DRO to the planer, I used a piece of off-the-shelf angle bracket that I bent to fit the space between the bed and the control stalk. After fussing around and getting all the measurements figured out, I drilled a couple of mounting holes where they were needed in the bottom of the planer bed. I had to disassemble the DRO so I could mark and drill the mounting holes on the bracket for the carrier, as it didn't come with a drilling template, which was kind of annoying. The entire assembly then bolted to the planer bed and the control stalk with a couple of pan-headed screws that were short enough not to pierce the cables inside the tubing. Here you can see how the whole thing went together. readout head has a couple of strong magnets epoxied into the back that easily stick to the metal stock. I just tidied up the cables a bit with some wire ties and left enough slack down at the bottom so that the bed could move up and down freely. I then checked the full range of bed motion for any binding and to ensure that the DRO showed the full depth of cut, which is approximately 4 inches. I had made an oversight error during the knife installation and subsequent setting of the infeed and outfeed roller heights. I had made my initial adjustment without the knives installed, but that meant that the knives were actually sitting proud of the rollers by about 1/8 of an inch. As you can see, the knives are engaging the stock, but the infeed roller is not. Fortunately, the adjustment here was pretty simple. Because I had already adjusted the rollers parallel to the table, I could mark the adjustment nuts and move the roller down by an even amount side to side. I ended up with 2 full turns of the nuts before the roller engaged as expected. The outfeed roller got the same adjustment as the infeed roller, although for the first couple of passes of actual stock during testing, the outfeed roller wasn't fully pulling the stock clear of the cutter head, and it needed to be adjusted down by about another 1/4 turn of each of the adjustment nuts. I suspect you would have to do a similar bit of fine-tuning on your machine as needed. As long as you mark the nuts and use the exact same amount of adjustment on both sides, you shouldn't have to recheck parallelism. At long last, it was time to run a piece of timber and make the first chips. You are seeing the absolute first time that I've ever put a stick through this machine. It was a triumphant moment with a few giddy giggles and a couple of big smiles. taking a few passes on the same board, I checked the thickness end to end and found it to be within about 10 thousandths, which is quite good, something less than about a 64th of an inch. I suspect that with some additional tweaking to the infeed, outfeed, and or bed rollers, this maybe could be improved even further. However, I'm quite happy with the results.